Welcome, Greek U Nation, to episode number 205 of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Eilon, CEO of Greek University. I'm a speaker and a two-time author. Our second book is now available on Amazon. It's called From Letters to Leaders, Redefining New Member Education and Leveraging Belonging to Eliminate Hazing. Go and pick that up today. We call these episodes the Fraternity Foodie Podcast because there is nothing like great food to bring college students together. Fun fact, many of you know that I'm working in the state of Tennessee to end opioid addiction and opioid overdose death. Not only are we doing education in businesses and schools, but we've now set up the first diversion center in the county. We have a jail-based transition specialist to help people transition into society from the prison system. We're now providing transportation for those in our rural county to get to treatment appointments, and we're providing medically assisted treatment for the uninsured. But now we're also working on a plan to have peer navigators in the emergency room at the hospital to make referrals to treatment anytime someone with a drug addiction presents themselves at the ER. So we continue to make progress there, and I think 2022 is going to be no exception. Stay tuned for more info on that. Now, speaking of addiction, our next guest is Patrick Chester. He spent 15 years as a raging gambling addict. He lost millions of dollars, and unfortunately, this destroyed his family. Patrick resorted to criminal acts to feed his addiction and ultimately ended up in jail. He's now 5 years free of that monster, and he has a new purpose in life. Patrick spent many years taking from people to feed his sickness. Now he's giving back, and it's an absolutely amazing thing. So I can't wait to share this story with our listeners. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Mike, happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to what should be an interesting conversation.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And I certainly know on college campuses, we run into gambling addiction quite often. So I think it's perfect for our listeners to understand this particular addiction a little bit better. So I'm so grateful that you're here on the show with us today. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about how you got started with gambling?
Sure. And, it was around, that, the college time period age. I was probably around 20 years old, when I started gambling with friends, and it was just a recreational activity that I didn't really understand or take too seriously. It was fun, right? We just had fun with it. We didn't, I didn't jump in with both feet, right? I mean, I started off betting $10 here, $20 there, but that progresses, and for me, it as we'll get into in a minute, it just evolved into a big time addiction for me. And one thing I'll say too is that back when I started, we didn't have all the online avenues, right? We didn't have online gambling or anything like that. I was betting primarily sports betting, through bookies and that sort of thing, but I was around 20, 21 years old when I first got started. And then it just, like I said, just evolved from there.
Yeah, that's what I'm so concerned with. We had another episode where we talked about pornography addiction, for example, and it's so available on everybody's smartphone that it's just a different era from when you and I started out, as 18, 19, 20-year-olds. It's just a different world today. It's much more accessible. And so that's what I'm really so concerned about when we start talking about today's college students. If you want to place a bet, I mean, they're advertising that on TV in the sports games. I mean, it's not even like we're trying to hide it anymore. But yet, we still look at athletes that for whatever reason, we can talk about Pete Rose gambling and other things that are not even in the Hall of Fame, yet they're advertising the gambling right in the sports event itself.
Yeah, it's gross, Mike. I mean, you said it well. I'll watch a football game now, and literally every commercial is there's some sort of gambling twist to it, or some sort of gambling aspect to it, and people are getting sucked into this now at young ages, and it becomes ingrained in them. And so that's the danger, and that's why I do what I do now. It's really about education and making people aware of what can happen. If you're not cognizant of it. If you're not aware of what is out there and what you're being fed.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're doing that work. What was your rock bottom? I mean, you talked about just starting out with $10, $20 bets. How did you hit rock bottom?
So for me, what happened was as it progressed and I didn't really know what was going on inside of my brain, addiction is a disease, and it's something that's going on in your brain. And so as that's developing and I don't realize it, I'm starting to work for myself. I worked for myself as a contractor. And so I had access to money, and it got to a point where $100 bets weren't enough for me. I had to bet $1,000 on a football game, and then I had to bet $5,000 on a football game, and then I had to bet $20,000 on, and so it spirals. And my rock bottom, this went on for, like you mentioned earlier, 15 years. So I was taking money from customers with the best intentions. My intentions weren't to take their money and hit the road and never fulfill my obligation to them. But as a gambling addict, when somebody hands you $30,000 or $40,000, that's a challenge. And I struggled with it, and I failed miserably. And so I was gambling with other people's money, ultimately ended up in jail. And that was my rock bottom.
Oh my God, what a disaster. I mean, how were you able to keep it a secret for so long? You obviously had customers that were counting on you. You had a family. I mean, how were you able to keep that a secret?
It was, as gambling addicts, we're pretty creative, right? And we can spin stories and convince people. I was very convincing, but after a while, the levee breaks, right? You can only plug so many holes. And customers of mine they would file complaints with the state. And then pretty soon I had one customer communicating with another customer, and it became this vicious circle and cycle that I couldn't get out of. And so the state got involved, the law enforcement got involved. And so ultimately, at the very end, my wife found out, but I was able to keep that a secret from my family for a long period of time. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when you're close to somebody like my wife, your spouse, you don't want to believe the worst, right? There were a lot of red flags that we look back on now, and my wife has struggled with, because things that she felt she should have picked up on, but didn't, because I convinced her that, well, it's not this, it's this, and I can fix it, and it's that sort of spinning concept that we use as addicts to convince people that everything's okay, when in fact it's not. But ultimately, that my wife and family found out back in 2015, and they were the ones who put an intervention together, which ultimately got me into treatment, which is what saved my life, basically.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a really difficult question right now, and I'm going to be kind of direct in asking it because I think it's an important question to ask at this time. Did you ever consider suicide?
I did. Yeah. And that was towards the end, when I had exhausted all my resources. As addicts, we do that. We burn all the bridges, friendships, family members. And it gets to a point where it becomes so isolating and you become so lonely as an addict that you cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's hard to envision a way out of the mess, right? I was consumed with debt, owing hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, and living a lie to my wife. So yes, I did. Towards the end, walking in the door every night and trying to convince my wife that things were okay when I knew deep down they weren't. My only option in my mind had become suicide. Yeah. And so fortunately I didn't reach that point, but I was entertaining the thought and trying to figure out ways to do it and make it look like an accident, in hopes that, maybe my life insurance would pay out for my wife and son at the time. So that's definitely something I considered.
Wow. So you talked about your wife and kind of living this lie for a very long time, even though you knew differently inside. Ultimately, how did your wife and your family find out about your gambling addiction?
I had sent out an email to a family friend. I think it was out of desperation, just at the very end, because the walls, like I said earlier, were just closing in. I think it was a desperate email because I didn't have the courage, Mike, to come right out and just admit it. I had thought about it many times and just, I didn't have the courage to do it, which a lot of addicts struggle with. But fortunately, I sent this email, and then that family member turned it over to my father-in-law. He was the one who informed my wife, and then they got together and they pulled a team of family members together and rallied around me and found a place for me to go to treatment and set up, like I said, this intervention to where that was the kind of the beginning of my turnaround, basically.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned treatment. Talk to us a little bit about that treatment. What does that look like? Tell us more about that so our audience understands what, getting help looks like.
Sure. And that's another thing too. Gambling addiction is a lot of people just don't know about it, right? We all hear about the heroin addict, the meth addict, the alcoholic, and we know that they can go 30 days into an inpatient facility and get help and try and turn their life around. And they go through this process of physical withdrawals, coming off of something. Well, for a gambling addict, you don't necessarily go through the physical withdrawals, but you do go through I did anyway, a 30-day inpatient treatment facility specifically designed to treat gambling addiction. And there aren't many of them. I think there are only 4 in the entire country, which is another thing I'm trying to make people understand and raise awareness about. We just don't understand gambling addiction, but you go in there, and for me, I was living in such a cloud. My brain had become so foggy. I didn't even know what was going on. I didn't know why I was making the choices I was making. I just knew they were wrong, and I couldn't figure out why I was doing it. But what they do is they let you decompress, and they explain to you what the process of addiction does to the brain and how it affects your choices. And so for me, it was 30 days of just trying to understand what this was. And then you leave there, and I left, they give you the tools to manage cravings and all these other sorts of things that addicts deal with, right? You don't just go to treatment and then all of a sudden, boom, you're fixed. Mm-hmm. It's a lifestyle that you have to, adhere to and follow the steps and manage your potential pitfalls and all the dangers that are out there. And so that's what it did for me.
What does that look like today? I mean, obviously now you've been 5 years free of that monster. I mean, do you have somebody that you're teamed up with for accountability? Do you go to treatment appointments today? What does that look like in terms of treatment today?
Sure. That's a great question. Yeah, because I've always been one that never wanted to get too far ahead of myself. I never wanted to be that addict that got to a point where 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, I just figured I've got this fixed and I don't need treatment anymore. I'm good. Because there are too many stories of addicts that get complacent and gradually will fall back into their addiction. And so for me, yeah, I continue with outpatient treatment. I have a regular therapist that I talk to that knows me and knows my situation. And meetings, now they're mostly online meetings, just basically staying engaged with the addiction community and my past. I never, as I mentioned, I never want to forget my past because it's brought me to where I am now. And in a sick, twisted sort of way, I'm kind of glad I went through that because of where I am today, but that's what I do. I just stay engaged and never get over my skis and too far ahead of myself and think I've got it.
Yeah, I really like that. And you're right. I mean, now with Zoom and virtual meetings, it's really easy to stay connected if that's what you want to do. I mean, if you want to stay connected, if you want to talk about it and try to get better. And I think, you have to commit to that over a lifetime because, as you said, it's so easy to kind of slip up and to head in the wrong direction again. So that's great to hear that you have all of those options today and you continue to work on it. I think that's really important. So what are you doing now to help others that might be struggling with similar addictions?
So there's a couple things, I'm working on a book and hopefully we'll have that out this coming spring or early summer. I've been working on that for a while now, and staying engaged with, meetings, that sort of thing. And speaking when those opportunities come up with predominantly younger people that just don't understand the dangers, right? And trying to educate people on the dangers of gambling because it's so commonplace in our society. And as kids, parents introduce their kids to it at very young ages. introduce our kids to alcohol or marijuana when they're 9 or 10 years old, but we certainly do with gambling. And so it's that sort of thing that I'm trying to do, just get the word out and make people aware of what can happen. I'm fully aware that 95, 96, 97% of the people that gamble can do it responsibly. But with anything, there's that 3 or 4% that can't, because they're either susceptible, the addiction runs in their family, or they have, they're predisposed basically to addiction. And those are the people I'm trying to reach.
That's great. I think the book is something that's certainly scalable, that just about anybody can pick up. So I can't wait for you to get that book out, and I'll love to read it and to talk about it with some of the college students. I think for you to be a speaker and speak in the college market, I think would be fantastic, because I know a lot of college students that really struggle with this. I see them betting on football games, for example, on a weekly basis. Some of them I know are really into horse racing, and like that's their vice. So I see a lot of it on college campuses, but nobody's talking about it. So I'm so grateful that you have this book that you're planning. I think that needs to get out as soon as possible. And just for you to continue that conversation on college campuses, I think would be fantastic. Now, there is so much stigma out there when it comes to just about any addiction. I mean, name your addiction and I'll show you the stigma that's out there. Why do you think that is?
I just think it's, Mike, I think it's lack of awareness, lack of education. A lot of people don't understand addiction, what they can do. And to be honest with you, I didn't either until I fell into it. It's real easy to look from afar, Mike, and judge somebody on the choices they're making, the lifestyle they're living, and just label that person as a bad person. Well, you don't know what's going on. If they're a full-blown addict, they could be a really good person who's in the throes of addiction, just making really bad choices. And that's what happens. And so the stigma, I think, comes with, again, lack of education, lack of awareness, people just not recognizing what addiction is and what it can do to the brain. There are inherently bad people in this world that do bad things because they're bad people. There are also really good people suffering from addiction that make bad choices. And so it's that. I just think people need to be aware. And that's part of why I do what I do. I want to talk to younger people and make them aware and educate them so that they know going forward, because we're all going to come across it, whether it's a friend, a family member, you're going to know an addict one way or the other. And so to be educated on it, to be able to help that person when they need it is a big deal.
Yeah, I think this interview is going to go a long way in terms of reducing that stigma around addiction, and in particular, this betting addiction, especially on college campuses. I think this is going to go a long way. So I'm just grateful that you're here with us today to talk about this. It's just so important. I mean, and people think that it's not something that's ever going to happen to them or in their family, but the reality is this can happen just about anywhere, really, in society. And I think it goes through all, races, religions, the wealth, if we want to talk about economies and things like that. I think it potentially can affect every family in America, right?
Oh, for sure. And again, it's everybody will be touched by addiction one way or the other, And I have 2 sons, and I want them to know growing up what the dangers are out there. I mean, you're going to there. And as you mentioned earlier, Mike, the kids growing up now, and when they get into college, they're exposed to so much more. I'm 49 years old. I wasn't exposed to what these kids are now, right? There are so many different things out there. And so really it's just trying to help them understand going forward. And, for me, it got to a point where I was instead of making my mortgage payment, I was taking that and gambling on betting on a football game. And so that's how this thing can spiral out of control before you know it. And the college campuses, like you said, you see it everywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing the message. I think that's really important. Now, I will tell you this, I love good food. So I have to be honest about that. At the Fraternity Foodie Podcast, we talk about food all the time. You're out in Seattle, and I know there's just incredible food out there. I'm sure the options in terms of seafood and other things are really good. I mean, what's your favorite restaurant out there these days?
Yeah, we do. We have a few options out here, and I love it. Yeah, seafood. I love seafood. And probably our favorite. My wife and I, we go to a place called Duke's Seafood, which is locally owned. There's a few of them around, and it's the freshest seafood you can get. It's halibut. It was halibut, salmon, oysters, whatever, right? I mean, so we love it, but there's also, we have a really good locally owned steakhouse too called Daniel's Broiler out here, and there are, I think, 3 locations, and we love that place too. So those are probably my 2 favorite restaurants out here.
That sounds great. I mean, for me, I live in Nashville, so I'm surrounded by land and no water. So we're probably going to head to Duke's if I end up in Seattle. So hopefully we'll get an opportunity to have dinner together and talk
For sure.
little bit more about this. But Duke sounds like exactly what I'd be looking for if
Right
I was
up your
out there
alley.
in Seattle.
For sure.
Oh, that's been great. All right. So let's say our listeners that are listening right now, let's say they want to connect with you. Maybe they want to bring you in as a speaker on their college campus. Where should they go in order to connect with you?
Mike, the best way to get in touch with me now is probably through my Twitter. I do a lot on there. I'm post basically everything I'm doing on there, and it's at Patrick Chester 9, the number 9. And that's really the best way to reach me right now. And again, it's really just about spreading the word and education and making people aware of something that they may not be aware of.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's really important for you to continue talking about this. There's not enough people talking about the other side of sports gambling, which is the addiction part of it, and how we can prevent our young people from spiraling out of control. And I think it can happen all too easily. So I appreciate you doing what you're doing. I hope that you're going to continue doing it. It's an important message. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Of course, it's my pleasure. And to our listeners, if you found Patrick's conversation to be helpful for you, please like it. Please share it with other college students that might be in this situation, so that way they can go out and get the help and the treatment that they need. So I think it's important for this message to get out to the masses. Please share it. And we hope to see you on another episode of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.